Okay, welcome back to Foundations of Christian Thought and Practice. We're now in our 10th theme. We've dealt with 3 themes from the New Testament. First, Jesus is the Messiah, and then secondly, Jesus is God. Remember that the Gospel of Mark is important for Jesus is the Messiah. Gospel of John, very important for Jesus is God. And then this last video, we dealt with the idea that God is a blessing to all nations. And remember, we went back to Luke-Acts. We went back to the book of Acts, which is historical in nature, trying to understand the church, the early Christians, and give a good history to that. There's so much that could be said on that score, but we have to move on from there. Now, as we move into theme number 10, which is basically humans are hopeless. I know that sounds awful, very depressing, but I think it's important that we use those terms. I've really thought about this and studied about this for years, and I think at this point this is about the best way that I could put it. But I want you to notice as we move into the next themes 10 and 11, we're basically dealing with the Apostle Paul. And in the book of Acts, we were introduced to the 2 most important human beings to the early church. And that would be the Apostle Peter and the Apostle Paul. And remember, we've talked about this a little bit, but even Peter and Paul in the book of Acts were arguing about how Jewish you need to be and whether or not the gospel can actually go to Gentiles. And remember, I've talked about in the past the idea that Paul will win the argument. And so Paul will argue, and we'll see this in just a little bit, in particular in the book of Galatians. Paul will argue in his letters that you don't need to be Jewish. In fact, the gospel, going all the way back to Abraham, was meant for the entire human race. Not only the Gentiles, but the ethne, not only for the Jews, but also for the Gentiles, the ethne. And so Paul will argue that the gospel has been intended for everyone from the very beginning. And Paul will also argue, again, in the book of Galatians, that you don't need to keep the Jewish law, that the Jewish law, now that Christ has come, no longer needs to be kept. Now, of course, Jews disagree with this to this day, and it is a major difference between Jews and Christians. But Peter will argue with Paul, and we even see this again in the book of Galatians. He's actually called Cephas in Galatians. And this argument will be quite intense between these 2 founders of Christianity and their disciples. But as I said, Paul will win the argument. And Paul will basically stipulate, he will state in his letters that he wrote to the early church, he will stipulate that you do not need to be Jewish and you do not need to keep the law. And he will actually, and this is very important for understanding the Apostle Paul, he doesn't pull these ideas out of thin air. You may totally disagree with Paul, but as you do, understand that if Paul were in front of me, I would ask him, where did you get that? Where did you get these ideas? And I think I think it's safe to say that Paul would answer, I got these ideas from the Old Testament. So I want you to see, and this is very important, because if you grew up like I did around here in East Tennessee, which I'm very grateful for, but if you grew up hearing that the Old Testament is law, and the New Testament is grace, that the Old Testament is law, and the New Testament is faith, I want you to see that that is a false dichotomy. There is faith in the Old Testament. There is grace in the Old Testament. And so never does Paul say, now watch this very carefully, never does Paul say that the law was bad. Paul is going to argue that the law was important. And again, you can read this in Galatians 3, 4, and 5. Paul will argue that the law was not bad. In fact, it was good and it was necessary, but it was the law that brought us to Christ. And so, you understand Paul's got a real problem here by being a Jew. And also not only being a Jew, but he was a Pharisee. He was trained in the Pharisaical tradition. So he knew his scripture well. Paul is going to argue that the law was necessary. This is how God worked for centuries, even for millennia. But now watch this. Paul is going to argue that faith is not a new thing. And guess who he goes back to? He goes back to, and this is in Romans and Galatians. He goes back to the person of Abraham. And Paul will emphasize this idea that even though Abraham was Old Testament, he came before the law. And in fact, Abraham was justified. That's the most important word relating to Paul. Abraham was justified not by keeping the law, but he was justified by faith. So as Paul forges a new direction, as Paul leaves Judaism and moves into Christianity, he's not saying the law was bad. He's not saying there was no faith in the Old Testament. There was no grace in the Old Testament. He's just saying now, and this is central, that Christ has come. Christ has fulfilled the law. And Christ has made a whole new way of being justified. Justified here means to be able to stand righteous before God. And so Paul is saying Jesus has come, he's fulfilled the law, and now that the law has been fulfilled, it served its purposes. And it no longer needs to be practiced. Now again, as we've said before, Jews would really disagree with this. And I also want you to understand that some Christians would disagree with this. The Seventh-day Adventists, for instance, would disagree with us on this. But I want you to see that Paul is essentially saying that faith has been there all along, again, all the way back to Genesis chapter 12, that God has been working by faith. So even though now we move into this new religion that's going to be called Christianity, again, I want you to see that the roots are deep within Genesis and deep within the Old Testament. And here's Paul, who was a Pharisee, who knew the Old Testament probably backwards and forwards. He doesn't say the Old Testament is gone, it's dead, it's no longer applicable. He's saying that actually Christianity emerged out of this. One of the most important images that Paul will use related to this is in Romans 9-11. Paul says that Christianity is the graft, it is the limb, the branch that is grafted onto the trunk. And the trunk here is Judaism. And so part of what Paul is arguing is the limb, the branch, would never be without the trunk. He's arguing that Christianity would never be without Judaism. And so Paul sees such an intimate connection between the branch and the trunk that if you separated the trunk from the branch, you wouldn't have the branch. And so I really want to emphasize this because most of you, again, if you grew up like I did and you grew up in a church anywhere probably in America, typically the Old Testament was ignored, or if it was used, it was kind of used in a proof text way. And I just really disagree with that. If we're going to frame a good Christian, I want to say Judeo-Christian worldview, then we've got to take the Hebrew Bible seriously, just like the Apostle Paul did. So as Paul makes the break, throws down the gauntlet into the way, into Christianity now, he doesn't do that by divorcing himself from the Old Testament. Now, let me say something else about Paul. Paul will be central for framing the classic Christian worldview. Let me say that again. Paul will be central for framing the classic Christian worldview. And think about this. There are some New Testament scholars who say that Paul is the founder of Christianity. Now, they don't say that because they don't like Jesus or they don't think Jesus is important. I mean, really, that's ridiculous. But these scholars, what they want to emphasize is the fact that Jesus never really broke from Judaism. He was born a Jew. He was crucified as a Jew. He resurrected as a Jew. He never really made the break from Judaism. Is he the founder of Christianity? Well, yes. But I want you to see that it really took the Apostle Paul to come along and interpret the death and the resurrection of Jesus. This becomes very important. Because for Paul, it's kind of interesting that in all the letters that he writes that make it into the New Testament canon, he talks very little about the teaching of Jesus. He talks very little about the life of Jesus, but for Paul, the center to his thinking, the center to the gospel, and I want you to remember this, is the death and the resurrection of Jesus. We call this the kernel, Kernel. The kernel to Christianity, the kernel, the center of Christianity for Paul is the death and the resurrection of Jesus. One of the reasons why there is a new way of justification with the coming of Jesus is because his death and his resurrection has fulfilled what was promised in the Old Testament. And so Paul is framing a new worldview, and this will eventually be called the Christian worldview. And in doing so, as much as he emerges out of the Old Testament and he takes that seriously, he will also frame a new way of thinking. If there's one lecture, one video that I think will help you write your final paper better than any other, it's this one. And so let me give you 4 points, 4 major ideas that Paul will lay down as he begins to give classic expression to this new Christian worldview. All right? 4 big words, but we're going to give them to you and then define them, and I want you to know these, and I want you to think about this as you get ready to frame your worldview. In the first place, Paul will make a break in what we call ontology. Ontology is the study of being, literally. It tries to answer the question, who are we as human beings? Now, of all the 4 categories, this will be the one that Paul makes the least amount of a break, if you will. Because in ontology, he will go back to his Jewish roots. And Paul, if you were to ask Paul, what does it mean to be a human being? Paul would go back to Genesis. He would go back to the creation. And for Paul, the answer is the imago Dei. It is the image of God. And so Paul will argue that everybody is a child of Adam. And as a child of Adam, they are created in the image of God. And so therefore, every human being has great dignity, both male and female equally. This will be very important to Paul because for him, it's neither Jew nor Greek, it's neither male nor female, it's neither master nor slave. Everybody is equal because they are created in the image of God. This becomes central to Christianity. And Paul will also emphasize the idea, though, that Christ will be the second Adam. So everybody is a child of the first Adam. Not everybody is a child of the second Adam. Only that will be Christ. And the reason why Paul is emphasizing that is because Christ is born of a virgin. And so therefore, Christ will not be born with the sinful nature that humans are born with. And this becomes very important for Paul. The second theme, the second big idea for Paul is what we're going to call anthropology. Anthropology. Anthropology is trying to answer the question, what is wrong with us? So if ontology is who are we as human beings, the second question, anthropology, is trying to really answer what is wrong with us? What is wrong with human beings? In many regards, this comes to the most important issue that every religion is trying to grapple with. Be it Buddhist, Hindu, Islamic, whatever worldview you want to talk about, every single religion is trying to grapple with what is wrong with human beings. Why do human beings harm one another, harm the earth, etc., etc.? And Paul is going to have a totally different answer to this. In the Jewish worldview, and notice the break here, in the Jewish worldview, what's wrong with human beings? Well, essentially, with the Jewish worldview, it is that people do sin. They don't follow the law of God. They don't follow the Torah. They don't know the Torah. And so Paul will argue that for the Jewish worldview, what's wrong with human beings? They don't follow the Torah. But now for Christians, he is going to argue that not only do human beings do sin, they are sin. All right, this is very important. To Paul, it's not that human beings do sin. Yeah, every human being does. But for Paul, one of the reasons why every human being does sin is because he or she is sinful or has a sin nature. And so you'll notice that's why I'm calling this theme, Humans Are Hopeless. According to Paul, here's the bad news. Humans are hopeless because they're born with sin. There's nothing that they can do about that. And that's kind of the extra bad news. Not only are humans born in sin, but they also can't do anything about it. And so that opens the door to theme number 3 with Paul, or the big idea number 3 with Paul, and that is what we call soteriology. Soteriology. Soteriology is trying to answer the question, what is the solution to such a bad problem? If the problem in Judaism is that people don't know and keep the Torah, then guess what the solution is? Yeah, exactly. Well, in Christianity, Paul is going to argue that essentially human beings are hopeless. There's nothing that they can do because they're born in sin. However, that's why Christ died and resurrected. Human beings can't do anything about it, but according to Paul, the solution is not the law. It's not human beings doing something. It's the fact that Christ has already done that, and it's accepting that by faith. You see that? So ontology, who are we? Anthropology, what's wrong with us? Soteriology, what's the solution for Paul? It's the resurrection, and it's the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ. And then number 4 is eschatology, the study of the last things. Paul will make a break here because he will teach 2 new ideas. Paul will teach that there is an afterlife, and we see this in 1 Corinthians 15, and we see this in 1 Thessalonians. And then Paul will also teach that Christ is coming back. And again, we see this in Thessalonians and Corinthians. And so Paul will introduce something. You understand, Jews don't believe, most of them don't believe in an afterlife. Christians will be very different. And it goes all the way back to Paul. Paul's going to teach a new concept, and that is the afterlife. And for Paul, those who die in Christ will be with Christ. And then Paul is going to argue that Christ is coming back. And so as Paul begins to frame a Christian worldview, and as he makes a break from Judaism, he throws that gauntlet down, he's going to make a break in ontology, anthropology, soteriology, and eschatology.